All right. Started because it is 4:20. I do welcome jokes during the discussion period. It was on my list of things to do today was to try to come up with a few really good cannabis jokes to MC this presentation with, and I didn't get to it. It is still on my to-do list, so you guys are going to have to pick up my slack. I'm Karen Urbanowski. I'm a scientist with the Canadian Institute of Substance Use Research and an assistant professor in the School of Public Health and Social Policy here at the University of Victoria. And I am going to MC our panel, our very illustrious panel of speakers who are going to share some of the findings from the research that we've done at our institute and the work that's been done by others, and just try to share a bit of information around what we know and don't know about cannabis pending legalization at midnight. To get us started, I would like to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen-speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I feel privileged and honored to be here on this land, and we thank them for that. So just a little bit about our research institute. We used to be called CAR-BC, the Centre for Addiction Research in British Columbia. So that's how some of you might know us. We're a network of individual scientists and teams that are dedicated to the study of substance use as well as addiction in support of community-wide efforts to promote health, to reduce harm. We have a variety of projects, and I encourage you to seek out our website if you're interested in learning about what more we do at the center. Come visit us sometime. We're up in the Technology Enterprise facility. It's a lovely building. Today, we're going to have 5 guest speakers, so I'll introduce them and give you a brief overview of what they're going to speak about. Each of our presenters will speak for between 5 and 10 minutes. They will receive a 1-minute warning at 9 minutes. And then at 10 minutes, I will forcibly remove you from the microphone. I do ask that you hold your questions until the end. We figure we'll let all 5 go, and then we can have a bit of a moderated discussion. How does that sound? Okay, fantastic. So first up, we have Adam Shirk. Adam is a doctoral candidate in the Social Dimensions of Health program here at UVic, and he is a research associate at CISUR and a Canada Graduate Scholar. His research is focused largely on substance use and health, and he's going to talk to us today about cannabis use in Canada, giving us an overview of current cannabis use in Canada as well as in BC. He's going to discuss some harms and some costs associated with cannabis from a recent national costing study that we were involved in.
Thanks. Okay, clearly I'm not illustrious at all, so I'm just here to set the stage for the panelists that will come. We'll just kind of set the stage. So we'll talk about how many people are using cannabis in Canada. And then like Karen said, we'll get into some potential harms and the cost to society of people using cannabis, what this might mean for us in Canada as we do this really monumental shift in substance use policy that's only been done in one other country in the world, which is Uruguay. Kind of hard to see. Oh, okay, I can see down here. Yeah, so I was going to say cannabis is the most widely used illicit drug in the world and also in Canada. So I put it in quotes because, of course, tomorrow those quotes will state it'll be legal, right? So this is something to keep in mind. In Canada, depending on the source of information you look at, between 10 and 20% of all adults have used cannabis, and then in some measure of time, say in the last year. If we look at, StatsCan is running this special survey right now called the National Cannabis Survey, and they're putting out quarterly results. If we look at their quarterly results from July to September, which just came out a few days ago for this year, we see that actually about 20% of adults, here meaning people 15 or older, in BC have used cannabis in the last 3 months. And in Canada, it's about 15%. So to put that into number of humans, in BC, that's 800,000 people have used cannabis in the last 3 months. In Canada, 4.6 million. So those numbers are right from StatsCan. I was surprised at how high that was. Was anybody else surprised at how high it was? The number of people? And a few people thought it was maybe too low. Does anybody think it's too low? I think it depends on your, And then there's there's quite a breakdown by age group. So 15 to 24-year-olds are about twice as likely to use cannabis as those older than that. Now I want to talk about a recent national project that our center, Canadian Institute for Substance Use Research, did in collaboration with the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction, hence the slides with two kind of title institutions at the top. A multi-year national study. That project has its own dedicated website, which is CISUR.ca. If anyone's interested to see some laptops, you could look at it now or later. We looked at, we categorized psychoactive drugs into 8 different categories: alcohol, tobacco, opioids, cannabis, and so on. And we looked at 4 cost categories. I know that's pretty small, but it's healthcare costs, economic loss of production costs when people are removed from the workforce, criminal justice cost, and other costs. So the cost of substance use in Canada, this is all substances combined, not just cannabis. We found that those psychoactive drugs cost Canadian society about $38 billion per year. That's an amount that's about equivalent to some of the maritime provinces' entire gross domestic product for a year. So like everyone working all year in Nova Scotia to produce what they produce, that's about the amount that it costs Canadian society of us using alcohol, cannabis, and other drugs. Now I want to focus in on that red circled graph. And here we can look at the 4 different categories of cost contributors to those 8 different substance types. And we want to focus in on cannabis today. So we can see from the graph that alcohol leads the way. It's the most harmful substance in society because so many people are users of alcohol. Almost 80% of all Canadians use alcohol in a given year. Cannabis is in 4th, but not many people use it right now, and this may go up over time. We'll see. So starting from the bottom and filling up that little pictogram from the bottom to top, we see that healthcare-related costs of people using cannabis was about 200 million. Lost productivity, people being removed from the workforce due to death or disability, was 350 million. And then a very large portion came from criminal justice costs, 1.7, 1.8 billion dollars. And we can speculate what might happen now that cannabis is going to be legal instead of enforcement costs around it being illegal. Focusing in on the health harms, so our study found for 2014, which was the most recent year, that cannabis is estimated to cause about 850 deaths and about 3,800 hospital stays per year. Something that is a contributor to those number of deaths is motor vehicle collisions. So driving under the influence of cannabis, or DUIC, is, and different studies have different estimates here, but right here I have a 92% increase, so you'd be about 1.9 times more likely to be involved in a collision if you're driving under the influence of cannabis as if you were not. And these results are very consistent, so it's kind of colloquially debated, but in the scientific literature, there's a very strong link that if you're driving under the influence of cannabis, your risk of getting into a collision is much higher than otherwise it would be. And then Russ is going to talk about this next, so I won't go into it very much, but there are a host of other conditions which we suspect or maybe posit that may be involved with cannabis use, but the research might not be quite there, and this is because it's been illegal. It's hard to study. So we'll have lots of new research directions when cannabis is legalized. Criminal justice costs, about that $1.8 billion in Canada per year, with policing, with courts, with corrections. And a lot of these are with the Federal Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. And tomorrow, of course, those will be removed. It won't be illegal anymore to possess certain amounts of cannabis or to sell it in authorized stores. So you could maybe posit that those costs will come down. You would expect that to happen tomorrow when cannabis is legalized. And then when I was preparing for this presentation, I just came across a few resources that I thought you'd be interested in. Amanda gave me the first one, which is heretohelp.bc.ca. That looks as kind of a focus on mental health and substance use of different types. They have a lot of information on cannabis. The federal government, some of you might have got that placard, which is mailed out by the governments of Canada or BC in the mail. And I just saw this website. I thought it was interesting. They talk about the health harms. They talk about some other things on there. And then some good information from New Brunswick, Cannabis 101. This third one, believe it or not, will give you a step-by-step instruction guide on how to roll a joint. So governments are doing different things across the country to prepare for legalization tomorrow. And then as a thought experiment going forward tomorrow and beyond, first of all, Canada is kind of like a staging ground for this incredible experiment in cannabis legalization. Again, Uruguay is the only country that's federally legalized cannabis globally. So a lot of like very developed countries, Uruguay is not quite as developed as Canada. They're going to be looking to Canada to see what happens. And the provinces and territories do it their own way. So there's these different experiments. What might happen, we expect to see from things that happen in the US, for example, Washington State, that the prevalence of cannabis use will probably go up once cannabis is legalized. Will this have effects on people's use of other psychoactive drugs, in particular alcohol? So Tim will talk about that in his talk. Then we think about health harms. Might these increase when people are using more cannabis? Maybe they're using it, more people are using it and using it more often. What might this do to collisions and so forth over society? And those criminal justice costs. So we're removing cannabis from the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act federally. That's going to reduce those costs, likely, I'm positing, but we can all think about that, how that will happen after legalization tomorrow. And maybe Karen's going to come back up each time, or that was the end of it.
That was great. Thank you, Adam. We did not have to forcibly remove you.
You had a
Stuck
minute
to
to spare.
So good.
Minute to spare.
So that was a really good way to get started in this conversation today, and give you an introductory overview on what we're looking at here. So thank you for that, Adam. I really appreciate the extent to which it's the researcher saying, hey, we're going to be able, it's going to be easier to do research now with cannabis. And so that is a benefit of legalization. So there you go. You can take that home if you're asked about benefits. The next talk we're going to have is going to be about that connection between cannabis use and health. We'll delve into that a little bit more. Dr. Russ Callahan is a professor in the Northern Medical Program at the University of Northern British Columbia. And he is working on cannabis-related projects at the Center for the Canadian Institute for Substance Use Research. Still learning the acronym. I just want to say that was a joint effort because you had it written wrong, and yeah, you did. It's all right. There's my proofreading skills, honestly. We're really very pleased to have you here today, Russ. For your talk on does cannabis use increase the risk of developing cancer in humans?
Okay, so I want to give you a cook's tour of this particular area of research on cannabis and cancer. Over the last 5 years, it's been a concern of mine, and I've conducted a few studies now on this particular issue. And so it's going to be fairly quick. I'll just give you an overview. I'll take questions after the panel is done talking. But let me see if I can try to give you a sense of this literature in 5 to 10 minutes. So there are good reasons to think that cannabis smoking may contribute to cancer in humans because cannabis smoke and tobacco smoke contain many of the same potent carcinogens. So given that, you would think that there may be some connection, at least with that route of administration and cannabis use. So one of the other things is that cannabis smokers often inhale more deeply. There are longer breath holding times. There's use of unfiltered joints, right? No one has a filter on a joint. And so these particular patterns of smoking or this route of administration with cannabis may contribute to the increased risk. Right? So we can talk about route of administration at the end of this presentation, how it may attenuate some of the risk as well with other routes of administration. So a few years ago, my students and I did a systematic review of all the studies on cannabis use and cancer. And we identified 19 studies, and they can really be grouped into 3 different areas by the sites of cancer. So we have one particular group of studies on lung cancer, the other on head and neck cancer, so cancers of the mouth and the throat and the neck, and then the last set of studies on testicular cancer. So out of those 19 studies, almost all of them can be grouped in those 3 areas. And so I'm going to talk briefly about those 3 areas. So the first one is lung cancer. Now, lung cancer is a paradigmatic cancer associated with tobacco use, right? Almost everyone knows that tobacco use causes lung cancer, at least today. I mean, a few decades ago, it was still controversial. So in general, with the cancer-related research in cannabis, we're 2 to 3 decades behind. So it's a particular area where we don't have that many studies. And I'll try to answer the question, does cannabis use increase the risk of developing cancer at the very end? Okay, so with lung cancer, there are 7 studies. 5 of them show a relation between cannabis use and cancer. Some of them show a dose-response relation. So 2 of the best studies in the field show no relation. So it's mixed, right? It's mixed. And one of the best studies pools all the information from other studies, and they show no relation between cannabis users who don't use tobacco and lung cancer. Because most cannabis users use tobacco, right? And so that particular issue of using cannabis, it may confound the relationship. So the relationship that we see in the scientific literature that shows that cannabis users have an increased risk or hazard of lung cancer, that may be driven by tobacco. So we only have one really solid study that's pooled all the users together from different studies who were non-tobacco users, cannabis users who didn't use tobacco. And that particular study found no relation. But that particular study also doesn't have long-term users and heavy users. So in general, there isn't sufficient evidence to support a relation between cannabis use and lung cancer. But there's enough there to be cautious. Okay. So the next one is head and neck cancers. This particular area is even more diverse in terms of the findings. Some studies show no relation, some studies show a dose-response relation, and some studies show a protective relation. So there's one study on tongue cancer that shows that cannabis users actually have a decreased risk. So this particular body of research, it has mixed evidence. It's hard to gain any kind of definitive conclusion. So this last area is really interesting, and I've done a study in this area, a long-term cohort study, where I found a relation between cannabis users and the development of testicular cancer. And there are 4 studies in the field. All of them show a relation between cannabis use and testicular cancer. But there are 2 types of testicular cancer. One is called seminoma, which has to do with cancers related to the semen-producing structures of the male testes, and then non-seminoma, right? So what we have is that there's a relation between cannabis use and non-seminoma cancer types. So just that particular type of cancer. But the problem with this area, we have 4 studies, all show a relation, but we don't have a persuasive description of the biological plausibility. So anytime in the epidemiological literature where we don't have a biological plausibility, I would say to people, be cautious about that until scientists come up and give you a real plausible description of that plausibility. So those are the 3 areas that we have right now. Almost all the studies are included in those 3 areas. And the final answer that I would say is that there isn't really strong definitive evidence to support a relation, but there's enough there to make us be cautious. Okay? So one of the things about the literature that will make you cautious, makes me cautious as well, is that when we look at the studies themselves, we don't measure cannabis use very well in the studies. We might measure it in terms of frequency, but we don't measure it in terms of dosing or how many joints people smoke per day, or the potency, or route of administration even. Right? So these are all going to happen probably in the next little bit. Now with legalization, we can construct longer term studies and so forth. So the other thing about this literature is that when you try to, in the recruitment process, we don't have long-term users who are heavy users. So when I talk about heavy users, I'm talking about people who use a joint a day for 10 years or more. So in the tobacco field, we have these long-term studies with tens of thousands of tobacco users, and we have very heavy users, and so we can estimate those relations quite well. But here in the cannabis field, we can't do that. We can't do that very well. So where does that leave us with legalization tomorrow? I think the evidence would support caution about using smoking as a route of administration. I mean, smoking is the primary route of administration right now, at least according to the 2018 National Cannabis Survey. It's one of the primary routes of administration. So it's the smoke that contains the carcinogens, right? The active components, THC, at least THC and some of the other components haven't been seen to be carcinogenic. So that's my take on the cancer cannabis field. The evidence isn't definitive yet, but there's enough to warrant caution in those three areas.
Excellent. Thank you, Russ. Now for something completely different. He missed it. He missed it. Oh, dear. Next up, we have Dr. Tim Stockwell. He is the director of CISUR and a professor in the Department of Psychology here at UVic. He's also a Monty Python fan, hence my introduction. You missed it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, good afternoon. This is a great day. There's some ironies, though, I think, about this legalization thing. Couldn't help noticing the sign. Did anyone see the sign coming into the building of no smoking, and there's a cannabis leaf? It took legalization for the hierarchy here to tell us not to smoke inside this building. It also took legalization to make it impossible for us to buy cannabis tomorrow, but we can buy it today. So there's just some of these interesting little anomalies. I think also I've heard the police say over the next year they're going to be ramping up enforcement of cannabis laws. It's taken legalization that pretty much don't enforce. Well, there's a bit of a problem. There are quite a few people have cannabis convictions, and we don't want that. So I'm going to talk about, trying to stand back a little bit. A lot of the thinking is that what's going to happen to cannabis use? What about cannabis harms? I think we have to look at the whole marketplace of recreational drugs. They all compete with each other, and what's going to happen. So I've got a little thesis, but I think that the main point is, like Adam said at the beginning, there's so many research questions out there, and I'm hoping this is something maybe Adam and others take on in the next decade, is to find out whether cannabis will substitute for alcohol. We've got some evidence, and I'll just try and give you a little rundown, as well as what the implications are. If cannabis is going to reduce alcohol consumption, what will that mean for public health and safety? So there are some clues. So this is not peer-reviewed research. This is a consulting company, Deloitte. I never can know that. Deloitte, thank you. They get the big bucks for telling the big alcohol industries what will happen to their sales when cannabis is legalized. They did an analysis of the legalization situation in the States and find there's about a 4.5% drop in the sales of some beers when pot was legalized. So this is not peer-reviewed work, but let's just we'll talk about some other studies. I just want to repeat, but add to a little bit of Adam's summary of the harms. And okay, there's lots of questions around these. Our estimates in the cost study for Canada in 2014, 850 deaths, compared with nearly 15,000 for alcohol in 2014. The other comparison, though, is the number of ways in which they can harm us. So for alcohol, there's different ways of counting. Some people say it's more than 300 conditions. It can kill you in more than 300 ways, or 50 to 60 major categories of injury and illness. Whereas for cannabis, it's really 4. roughly. The substance use disorder, well, it's a harm, maybe not a cause of death, impaired driving. Lung cancer, we took the view that there's biological plausibility along the lines and some evidence, at least for the heaviest users, that aren't smoking. And that was a weakness in that very good study, didn't have many heavy users. Also psychotic illness, and part of our reference here is the WHO's Global Burden of Disease studies, a whole series of studies trying to estimate harm from preventable risk factors like substance use in the world, in the whole world. And their take, and they've got scores of scientists working on these issues all over the world. We've collaborated with some, and that the standard at the moment is to assume that heavy cannabis use is a risk factor for psychotic illness in terms of precipitating it in vulnerable people. I've had lots of, I hope we're going to have a nice argument with Scott today. Scott, my dear colleague, Scott McDonald, I've enjoyed so many arguments with you, so many things we disagree on. And one is he's very skeptical about this evidence for cannabis and psychosis. I think it's quite strong and it's a concern. And the WHO takes the view that it at least extends the duration of psychotic illnesses. Anyway, that might have occurred anyway. So no comparison. Alcohol is about 15 to 20 times more harmful to Canadians at the moment with patterns of use. Now, will it increase the consumption of alcohol? Economists tell us so. Very clever economists who have reviewed the literature have predicted changes in price and consumption. There's various evidence in terms of some of the outcomes that have been observed in Oregon, for example. When some of the studies have found little effect when looking at adolescents. And I think you would predict of all the groups that are going to be most affected by legalization, there's all this concern about youth, but I mean, it still should be hard for them to access cannabis. In fact, it might be harder. And you think of the situation with tobacco, there's more teenagers using cannabis than tobacco, and tobacco is the legal product. It's not clear to me that you should expect to see an increase in cannabis use among adolescents. Or when it's legalized, it might go in the reverse. So one has to bear that in mind. There's also availability theory in the alcohol policy and epidemiology literature. We've been studying this for decades. It's very, very clear that by and large, is this very general rule, the more convenient the access to alcohol, the more affordable, the less restrictions on promotions and marketing, the more people use. And this applies to all products. It's shoes, cornflakes, automobiles, jackets, you name it. If the more available and accessible and convenient and affordable they are, the more people use them. And that's certainly been the case with alcohol. We predict one can be confident that consumption of cannabis is going to increase after legalization. Now, what is the evidence for substitution? A colleague of ours, Philippe Lucas, has published some nice studies of people prescribed cannabis and asking them about how it's affected their patterns of use. And they report reductions in use of opioids and alcohol. We need better longitudinal studies. It's a very cross-sectional study, but it's kind of interesting and encouraging. One study that struck me, and we're going to need more of these, and this is not peer-reviewed. This appeared in the media, and it was just a study put on a website, a US university website. Somebody got thousands of observations in all the states of the US where that medical marijuana was legalized, and they looked sort of month by month by month alcohol sales before legalization and after. And they estimated on average, all other things being equal, a 13% reduction in alcohol sales after the legalization of medical marijuana. There's been a systematic review of this, but it's full of the studies with very different designs, suffering from a lot of individual level studies and the self-report nature of this. But nonetheless, there's a slight preponderance of evidence favoring substitution as opposed to additive effects. But we don't know which is going to win out in Canada. Lots of things will come into play? Are people going to be allowed to smoke cannabis in bars? Are there going to be places where people can only smoke cannabis or use cannabis and not alcohol? This is going to shape the answer. But there's reasons to think that it's quite likely there will be some substitution. So we have a wonderful model for estimating what, if you get a change in alcohol consumption, and this is used in a lot of our studies, what does that mean for deaths and hospital admissions attributable to alcohol? And applying this program to Canada, it's what drove our cost study that took 12 people 2 years to produce. We just ran the numbers again, and if alcohol consumption was 5% lower, just suppose cannabis substituted, reduced sales by 5%, it could be more, we'd have 792 confidence intervals around that, say nearly 800 alcohol attributable deaths, nearly 6,000 fewer alcohol attributable hospital admissions. And my final slide just shows for hospital admissions how we'd predict if there was a 10% reduction in alcohol sales, you'd get further reductions in hospital admissions. So this is a really big question, and I hope somebody's going to be observing this very carefully. We shouldn't just narrowly look at cannabis-related outcomes. We need to look at impacts for all the different substances, especially the most prevalent ones like alcohol and these days opioids. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Okay, next up, we have Dr. Scott McDonald, who is a professor in the School of Health Information Science here at the University of Victoria and a scientist at CISUR, formerly our assistant director. And he's no longer our assistant director because he and Tim kept fighting about whether or not cannabis causes schizophrenia. I'm just kidding. That's not true. That's not true. Scott's going to talk about, Scott's going to talk about impaired driving laws and cannabis, and specifically looking at several questions related to the proposed impaired driving laws that will take effect this evening. So what are our driving laws? This is useful information, clearly, for us to have. What are the acute effects of cannabis for driving? What's the relationship between THC levels and performance for smoked and ingested cannabis? Oh, they're all above me. Awesome. And will the new laws be better for identifying cannabis-impaired driving? So we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Okay, thanks, Karen. What I'll be talking today about is contained in my new book, Cannabis Crashes. Looking in the literature, found that there's many myths about cannabis and what it can and cannot do, and some truths. One of the truths is cannabis does impair performance at some level. Anyway, as Karen's already done my first slide, so I'll move on to the second one, which is screening test. And it's calibrated at 25 nanograms of cannabinoid. So in cannabis includes about 400 different compounds. And what these immunoassay tests do is they pick up different cannabinoids, and they all add up to 25 nanograms. So that's not to be confused with a blood test, which looks at just THC. The next component, which is down here, is police can use a blood test, a confirmatory blood test, which identifies THC. And if you have a reading between 2 and 5 nanograms of straight THC, you're subject to what's called a summary conviction, which is a lesser criminal offense. And if it's over 5 nanograms of THC, you're subject to an indictable offense. Exactly how the blood tests will be conducted in the field is not really well specified. if a blood test is to have any validity, it has to be done practically immediately upon suspicion of impairment, as you'll see with some of these other slides. The acute effects of cannabis. Research, as I mentioned before, cannabis does impair performance. The acute effects, it does slow reaction time. It reduces attention and divided attention tasks. And at higher levels, it does reduce psychomotor coordination in some studies, not all studies. Now, what does this do to people who are actually decide to drive under the influence? Well, studies have shown that it increases, they drive more cautiously, increases the distance driving behind cars and reduces average speeds. Now, the intensity of effects, obviously, the dosage matters. How cannabis is taken, whether it's smoked or ingested, and we're going to be looking at a slide on that. And how often a person has used cannabis. So frequent users are able to compensate a lot better. These are some findings from a study that I did a few years ago when I asked people in treatment for cannabis use disorders and other problems. When they drive under the influence of cannabis, how do they drive? Close to 40% said they drive more cautiously, and close to 30% said they drive normally. 2.4% said they drive more recklessly. Now, when we asked about cocaine, the race and reckless driving increased quite dramatically, and the cautiousness went quite down. So cannabis tends to be a bit of a harm avoidance type of drug. When people are under the influence, they know it better than they know they're under the influence of alcohol, which is, incidentally, is by far the worst drug out there in terms of traffic crashes. Now, this is a study where we looked at THC levels in the green compared to subjective reports by subjects of how high they felt. And as you can see, in the first hour, when people are subject to the highest, their THC levels are over 20 nanograms, which so if somebody has over 20 nanograms of THC in their blood, I think we can say with a great deal of confidence that they're under the influence. But this area in here is kind of like air. We would ideally like the THC to mirror the high perfectly, and this is subjective high, which we don't know how it relates to actual performance. Incidentally, these subjects use 69 milligrams of THC. They smoke THC. Milligrams, I would say in my book, I'm saying a standard dosage should be 10 milligrams for lack of any better ideas. It shouldn't be expressed in percent THC. That's for sure, because the amount consumed depends on the potency by the amount that the weight that is actually used. So 69 nanograms, that's a pretty high dose for smoking cannabis. You compare this slide here with ingesting cannabis, which was another study. This is looking over time after ingesting 45 milligrams of cannabis, so less, but they're ingesting it all. And they're reporting they're much higher at their peak, and the high lasts a lot longer. Here we have THC, which doesn't spike nearly as high. And then we have this other metabolite called hydroxy-THC. So when people use cannabis, the THC is actually metabolized in the liver and turned into one metabolite, which is actually considered very psychoactive in itself, is hydroxy-THC. And it spikes a lot higher when eaten than smoked cannabis. How are we doing for time? Okay. One of the limitations of these slides, so I'll just go back. This is the first one, smoking cannabis and eating cannabis. So I'm trying to put them side by side. I had to adapt the data a little bit to visualize the differences. These are all based on averages of all the subjects. And one of the big problems or limitations with cannabis research is that there's a great deal of variability between people and how cannabis affects them. So there's a large degree of variability in how cannabis affects them. There's also a very large degree of variability in terms of THC levels when subjects are administered exactly the same amount of cannabis. And this variation has not been taken into account very well in the studies. You saw the previous slides, looking at these were the averages. So you could see at about 5 nanograms is about, it could be 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours. There has been a study of a daily cannabis user who had a THC blood level of 3.7 nanograms after 6 days of abstinence in a clinical setting. Another limitation is daily users are much better on performance tasks than occasional users. There have been some studies of daily users looking at performance, and they found absolutely no difference between them when they're using cannabis and not using. What's this? Okay, the risk of cannabis compared to alcohol. So I've mentioned that.
There we go.
Okay, we'll bring it up faster. Okay, this is what one study showed the risk curve of cannabis is. At low dosages, below about 5 nanograms, it's actually, they're less likely to be in crashes. And then when the dosage goes up, they're more likely to be in crashes. And that compares to alcohol, where there is also a slight protective effect at very low levels that researchers have tried to explain, but not satisfactorily to my liking. But I think when people have small amounts, they kind of compensate for it, and they drive more cautiously. 2 to 5 nanograms THC in the whole blood is not associated with an increased risk. THC thresholds of 5 have not more have not been validated. The new laws will not accurately distinguish impaired and non-impaired drivers better than the old laws, in my opinion. And you can get more information. There's a book sale on today, $20. Anybody here?
We do have copies of the book here, and Scott will be available to sign your copy after the talk. Last up, we have Dr. Trudy Norman, who is a research associate, also at CISUR, with our Knowledge Exchange Unit. And she brings interests in phenomenology, health equity, and social justice to the way that we share knowledge and generation of our knowledge products at CISUR. Trudy is going to talk to us today about the golden opportunity given with legalization. Positioning legalization is more of a cultural moment that is going to give us an opportunity to engage in more dialogue around cannabis and the place that it has in our lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, my chat's going to be a little bit different than the other folks. What we do in Knowledge Exchange is we take the research that's done by my colleagues and research that's done across Canada in different countries, and we talk about, we do summaries, but we also take what comes from that knowledge and translate that, is the exchange part, into things that we think would be helpful to the general public. And so what we see here is we do actually a number of things like the here to help bc.ca. We have a number of resources that are part of that. We have a number of different kinds of things that folks can pick up and use outside. But we see this as as Karen pointed out, a cultural moment. It's a time when things are changing, and it's a significant change in Canada. As Adam had said, we are only the second country to absolutely legalize cannabis. And so what we would talk about and what we would say is that, let's see, it is an opportunity. And it's a huge opportunity that from between today and tomorrow, we take like a very pragmatic and a harm reduction kind of focus in many ways. People are smoking cannabis today, and they're going to be smoking cannabis tomorrow. So what can we do, and what can we talk about? How can we leverage what we know and the people around us to help have a conversation, which is a dialogue, about what does cannabis mean to us as individuals? What are we going to use it? How is it in our families, in the schools? We're currently preparing some guides for Ministry of Health. How are we going to deal with that in the schools and in our communities? And relationships are a key asset. And no, this is not a counseling course, right? But this is what we have. This is what we have, and all of us have in our everyday lives. And we have a lot of different ideas, even among us as researchers. We have different ideas about cannabis and whether or not it can cause psychosis or not. So that's not all clear, that's not all laid out. But what we have is we have to live with each other, and we have to deal with each other on a daily basis. And how can we use this moment, this time, the legalization of this drug, to continue those conversations and have meaningful conversation? So we talk about dialogue, and we have a specific approach to dialogue. So to dialogue is to inquire and to learn, to integrate perspectives, uncover and examine assumptions. And discussion and debate, very different kinds of things. Telling, selling, justifying. We're looking to try to encourage folks to understand each other and talk to each other, rather than just say, well, this is what I think, and just stick with the facts. We all have the facts. There's lots of facts to be had. But what's meaningful is dialogue, the principles of dialogue. So how do we make use of what's going on in our families? How do we take what we know, the basic kinds of things that we know, and how do we integrate these? That in a family when you have youth, children and youth, is that thing that you trade on with them, and what you have is that relationship with your young people, or the relationship with the people who are caregivers, with your family, with your friends. And how can we then, especially with young folks, how can we bring them to actually come to us when they have questions, so that we can actually talk about what's going on, and they might elect to come and speak with us before they actually decide to use. And we can have those kinds of conversations with folks. Because using cannabis, using any drug, is not separate from the context in which we live, in the communities, the families. We're not separate from that. And that part tends to go on for a while. But what we can do is, like I said, keep talking about it. So empathy, diversity, understanding power, and promoting curiosity and learning, and exposing judgments and assumptions. So we would, and we do encourage people to engage in dialogues. And we're also carrying out a number of cannabis dialogues in different places in the province, and opioid dialogues, where we bring people from communities together, from changing the cultures of substance use on campuses, to come together to actually talk about what's important to them. What do they need to know? What kinds of information do they want to have? And to strategize together about what might be important for them as individuals or as a campus, for example, in developing a policy around substance use or around cannabis use for their particular university. I wish I had a glass of water. Okay. So then, in terms of cannabis and a dialogue, here's what we might have to talk about. So we have like a two-axis kind of thing. Now, I don't know how readable that is, because it's a picture of something we're just working on, of the potential harms and benefits of cannabis use. So that we know that tomorrow there's legalization for recreational or non-medical use, but it has been, cannabis has been legal for medical use since 2001, I believe it is. So we look at potential harms and benefits. So if harm goes left to right and potential benefit goes up and down, you know that curiosity or experimental use tends to have a lower potential for benefit and less potential for harm. Whereas this is medical use for short-term pain, for nausea, sometimes for folks who are having cancer treatments, for example. That has been shown to help increase appetite. So there's less potential for harms and higher potential for benefits. But when you get towards the right, for example, where there is medical use, but for long-term use, for example, potentially long-term use for pain, there's a higher risk of harm, and a higher risk of harm and lower for benefit. Or if people are using cannabis, for example, in youth, research has shown that youth that use cannabis for example, to deal with uncomfortable feelings and deal with emotions, tend to have more difficulties. They tend to be higher users and use it more often, and that can lead to harms. So we have a little saying we use called not too much, not too often, and in safe place. And that's the sort of thing that we look at for trying to encourage folks to do that. So we lay out these kinds of ideas for youth and their families, for parents, and lay these out, what we know in terms of the evidence, and then situate that in how can we talk about that? How can we engage? And so at this point, we look not just for, as I said, for youth and families, but we're looking for the wider community and putting out some ideas that we have about how to engage people in the wider communities. How do we want our schools to look? Not just outside the legal, because there is all the legal aspects around and having a school or within a certain distance of the school, but there's other kinds of things that we can control. And what kind of a attitude, what kind of a culture do we want to have in our schools, and how we want to be in our communities, for example? How do we want, people have a whole range of attitudes, a whole range of levels of use. Well, we want them to be included, be part of the dialogue. Is that now that cannabis is legal, how can we make that more inclusive? And that the discussions that we have around cannabis can be only one place in a whole range of discussions that you can have in terms of critical thinking about the issues and how we might move forward and create kinds of communities and living situations that we all might want to live. So that's the frame that we take. Right, this is one of my favorite about dialogue. Passionately committed to our own and passionately committed to understanding. Introduce a way that remains open to inquiry. And that's basically my one big point. Resources, here to help bc.ca. As I said, we have a number of resources on that. The CISUR's website, cannabis.gov, is actually that cannabis clarity, and then from the federal government.
Thank you.